Okay, today we are going to finish up Chapter 17 on Reconstruction with the second half of Section 17.4. After Reconstruction comes to an end under Rutherford B. Hayes, because of the Compromise of 1877, you're going to have some changes in the South. Some good, some bad. So you're going to have a new ruling party in the South. It's the Democrats, but it's the New Democrats. The Democrats that weren't really, you know, not the same slaveholding Democrats as before, but they are going to institute some new laws that will definitely keep African Americans from being treated equally. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So the landowners from before, those plantation owners, they used to be the ruling class, but not anymore. 12 years after the Civil War, it's merchants, it's bankers, it's industrialists. This whole year, I've talked about how from the beginning of our country, the North was industry, the South was agriculture. This changes 10 years after the Civil War, 12 years after the Civil War. These merchants, these bankers, these industrialists, they were known as redeemers. They opened the door for the rise of the New South. Southerners thought that they needed to become industrial to help their economic problems, and they're right, they needed to definitely change their industry. So this new economy in the South was based on coal and iron and tobacco, cotton, and lumber. So it was a combination of industries. It wasn't simply just agriculture. So let's talk about some industries that grew. The textile industry grew. That is the making of material. Iron and steel grew. This was really important because you're going to hit the turn of the century here, almost at the 1900, and you're going to see skyscrapers go up. But that couldn't happen without the steel industry because skyscrapers are made of steel, not just iron. So Henry Bessemer was the creator of something called the Bessemer process. Basically, it was a chemical reaction that produced steel from iron. It took iron, they added some chemicals and heat and pressure, and it creates steel. So by 1890, the South produced 20% of the nation's steel. The South still had a rural economy, though. They had more small farms instead of the large plantations. Most of these plantations, these estates, turned to sharecropping. We mentioned that earlier. Sharecropping is where you rent a part of a larger plantation. Those farmers really depended on cash crops. They became very important. These are crops that could be sold easily and for a decent amount of money. But this also forces the South into further debt because it doesn't allow people to move out of this sharecropping. It kind of creates this new class, not completely poor, but can't get ever out of the cycle of renting land. Could never really afford to buy land. All right, so let's talk about some of the not so good things that happened in the South after Reconstruction ended. The South becomes this center of a divided society. True, there was no more slavery. However, equal rights were far, far from being the norm. So let's start with voting restrictions. A lot of southern states found a way to get around the 15th Amendment, which meant the 15th Amendment said you couldn't deny someone the right to vote based on their race or their previous servitude. And so the South found loopholes to keep African Americans from voting. One of these was a poll tax. So it's basically a fee that people paid to vote. There were no laws against it. The 15th Amendment doesn't speak anything to how much money you have or how much money you make. And so this poll tax kept, obviously, people that didn't have money from voting. And this just didn't affect the African Americans. It also affected the poor whites who couldn't afford this poll tax. Then you also had literacy tests. So you had to explain part of your state's constitution. It's hard to do that when you can't read or you haven't been taught to read. And so you have poll tax, literacy tests, and then you had the grandfather clause. This allowed people that failed the literacy test to vote if your fathers or grandfathers could vote. Okay, so obviously this is aimed at African Americans, right? Because if you're a poor, or if you're an uneducated white man, but your grandfather or father could vote, then you were excused from the literacy test, right? But obviously in 1877, an African American slave would not have had a father or grandfather that could vote because that would have been before the Civil War. So again, a loophole to keep African Americans from voting. And so then on top of that, you had the South passing Jim Crow laws. So a Jim Crow law was a law that basically required African Americans to be segregated in public places. Right. So all Jim Crow laws, they all had that in common, regardless of the situation, whether it was in a school or on a bus. Obviously, that's coming because it's only 1890 here we're talking about. And what made this legal was a court case that was tried in the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson made segregation legal, and the condition that made it legal was if the accommodations were equal. Now, this is again another loophole because equal meant, okay, if there are 5 seats in this school, there has to be 5 seats in that school. But what it doesn't mention is the location of the school. It doesn't mention the condition of the seats. And so there are a lot of things that made these places that were segregated, they certainly were not equal in condition. They might have been equal in number or size, but location and condition, they were not equal. So let's talk about what was the impact of Reconstruction. Was it a success? Was it a failure? Did the government try and do the right thing after the Civil War? Well, it's both a success and a failure, like most things in life. It was a success in that the South did begin to rebuild its economy after the devastation of the Civil War. And there's no doubt that that war was devastating. However, and on top of that, African Americans did gain rights that they did not have before. Slavery was no longer legal. 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, African Americans were considered citizens because they were born on this land and also could not be denied the right to vote based on race. But the failure was that the economy still remained rural as a majority, meaning most of the economy in the South was rural. You had those pockets of industry, but most remained rural. Rural means not in a city, meaning farming. Debt was still a problem, but probably the biggest failure of Reconstruction was allowing segregation to gain a foothold in society. This will last for 100 years almost after the Civil War. I mean, it's something, it gains a foothold, and it's going to take another 100 years for that segregation to end. So we obviously won't get that far in our history books, but that is one of the failures of Reconstruction. And this brings us to the end of chapter 17. Thank you so much.